Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. I'm Florence Reed. The French election results came out last night with the highest turnout in 25 years. The right-wing National Rally, or Rassemblement National party, was predicted to win with the most seats, but it came in third in a shock result that has covered the front pages this morning. It was a hung parliament in the end. The left coalition, the New Popular Front, dominated by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, won the most seats, but not quite enough to form a government, so they will likely have to make an alliance with Emmanuel Macron's centrist bloc, otherwise known as Ensemble. The right party that I mentioned earlier, Rassemblement National, is led by Marine Le Pen and the young Jordan Bardella. They're both interesting figures in French politics, and I wanted to get a little bit deeper into the story because it might not just be what it seems. Louis-Vincent Gave joins us. He is one of our favourite writers. We were actually due to speak last week, but I'm glad we didn't, as that would have aged very poorly given the results were almost exactly the opposite of what we had happen last night. Welcome to UnHerd, Louis-Vincent.
Thank you so much for having me, and you're absolutely right. If we'd done this a week ago, I'd have a lot of egg on my face right now. So I'm very grateful we're doing it today instead.
So why did the predictions get it so wrong? I mean, I know we constantly are going in cycles of asking this. How could it possibly be that the pollsters have got it wrong again? But why in this case do you think the predictions were so out of whack with reality?
I don't think we should be too harsh on the pollsters, to be honest, because when it comes to the absolute number of votes, they basically got it right. They basically got roughly 37% of the vote, and that leaves them with a quarter of the seats. If you compare that with England, in England, Labour did 36% of the vote, and they got 2/3 of the seats. It's just the way that within each district, the Rassemblement National lost a lot of close races, and as a result, ends up with fewer seats. So it has more to do, I think, with the way the vote is organized than perhaps the pollsters having done a terrible job.
The buck also slightly stops with the journalists here, I'm afraid to say, in that it's the front covers of the major newspapers. I saw France 24 had obviously prepared a graph and that showed a kind of massive sweep for the Rassemblement National, and then it turned out that that wasn't quite the case, and so they had to quickly rush to try and reorder that graph on live television almost. So perhaps there is more fault there to be had with the journalists writing the headlines more than anything.
I'm not going to throw a stone because, again, if we'd done this a week ago, that's exactly what I would have predicted. If you look at the market's reaction to this, the market has basically shrugged it off. The French stock markets had a fairly non-eventful day. The euros had a fairly non-eventful day. And even French bonds have had a fairly non-eventful day. Now, I'm not sure this is the right reaction, but for all the surprise effect, it doesn't seem like the market was really priced for a massively different outcome either.
Right, so the kind of front page story of socialism sweeps France is not what the markets are seeing.
Or maybe socialism swept France a long time ago. But jokes aside, you look at France, we have the highest level of government spending in any OECD country in history. I mean, right now the government is spending 58.5% of GDP. We have the high level of taxation of any country. So, of course, you could say now it's going to be even more so. But the reality is France has been socialist a long time.
So to some degree, it's business as usual for France, in fact.
And this is the most frustrating thing about France, I think, because fundamentally, we have a rather conservative population. We are a conservative country at heart. But we also have the dumbest conservative parties in the world. And as a result, we end up in the situation where the left controls all the narrative. They control the culture, definitely. They control the universities, they control the schools, and they definitely control the economy. And this is mostly because the right is divided, something that you're now experiencing in Britain. And the reason Labour ended up with 2/3 of the seats isn't that Labour ran a great campaign, isn't that there was a massive left-wing surge in Britain. It's simply the right was divided.
And in many cases, it was a protest vote against the rising right, or what was considered to be an ascendant right. In these elections, it does feel that, to a certain extent, some sort of messy majority has been born out of individual protests against the potential of a rightward shift in French politics. Is that a sense you get? Is this a win for Macron, or is it more of a loss for Le Pen?
So I'm not sure it's a loss for Le Pen, actually. Looming behind all of this, and frankly, I think looming behind Macron's decision to call for the election in the first place, is the fact that come September, France is going to have a massive fight with the European Union. France has been running completely irresponsible fiscal policies. We have the highest budget deficits of any country in Europe. And we're going to be presenting a budget for 2025 that will most likely be rejected by the European Union. So I think Macron, when he called the election, really had two choices. The first, two options. The first was that the Rassemblement National won, and then they would be stuck with the fight with the European Union. And then he could say, look, these guys aren't trustworthy. They can't run a government without starting fights with the European Union, etc.
This was the tactic to kind of stitch up Jordan Bardella, who's the kind of young, ascendant right-wing figure in France, is to put him in a position where he is then doomed to fail.
Exactly. So, because whoever presents the budget in September is doomed to fail. So now you could say Macron now has the second option. So that didn't work. So now he has the second option of turning to Europe and saying, look, if you don't let me run this budget, the option is even more further left. You have to let me run this budget because the French people have voted for more spending, and therefore I have to give it to them. Otherwise, again, you're going to end up with the worst outcome. So now whether the European Union goes for this in September or not is the big question, because I think basically by September we end up with one of two things. Either a crisis within the EU, where the EU tells France, look, you got to stay within the rules, or at least pretend to try to stay within the rules, at least, give us some face, option one. Or option two, the European Union says, nope, this is the budget you need to have, at which point we're going to have massive demonstrations all across France.
But of the three major characters in this race, of Mélenchon, Macron and Le Pen, Macron is surely the kind of most attractive prospect for the Eurocrats. If you're sitting in Davos, he is obviously the one that you would like to be running that country, irrespective of your views of his fiscal policies. Is that what he's selling now? And do you think Europe will buy it come September?
Basically, that was the play for him, to tell Europe, look, this is what I'm having to deal with. So, help me out. Otherwise, you're going to be dealing with somebody worse. That was Macron's play. Whether it works or not come September will determine whether we have a crisis within Europe or a crisis just within France.
How about this kind of unholy alliance then with the left, with Mélenchon's people? Because it's not just that the right is split, as it clearly is in France, but almost every part of the political spectrum is split. How is Macron going to deal with all of those factionalistic minorities that he's going to come up against in the coming weeks and months?
So first of all, the French left has always been fairly divided. It's always been, the People's Front of Judea versus the Popular Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front. If you look at the presidential elections in France, sometimes you've had 2 or 3 Trotskyite parties running. Like even the Trotskyites themselves couldn't unite into one party. So you've always had this element of division in the French left. You've had a decently strong Communist Party, a decently strong Greens, a decently strong Socialist. So it's always been that division. What unites them and what united the French people yesterday, I guess, is not a common program, not common ideas, but a common hatred of the Rassemblement National. And so today in France, I think we have a political situation where most people actually don't vote for something, they vote against someone, which as you point out, is really not healthy. The main thing in France is you say you faire barrage, you build a dam. So everybody's turned into a bunch of beavers, building dams everywhere, but you don't really build anything by being against something. But for now, I think today the fear of the Rassemblement National is, I guess, strong enough to put a government together. But let's not kid ourselves that today in France you have 3 very separate blocs, and Michel Onfray, a French philosopher, put it best. What was very unique when you looked at this French campaign was when you went to rallies, you had 3 separate flags. If you went to the Rassemblement National rallies, obviously you had a bunch of French flags. If you went to the Ensemble rallies, you had a bunch of European flags. And if you went to the Front Populaire rallies, you had a bunch of Palestinian flags.
This is the philosophical divide we're looking forward to in France, is which of these philosophical routes will France take?
Well, there is one common ground, and the common ground and how you basically paper over those cracks. And the common ground is have the government spend more money. That is the one common ground really between those three parties. Now, of course, people will differ as to where the money will come from. The Palestinian flag faction will say we need to tax the rich more, even though they're already the most taxed rich people in the world. somehow they should be good for more squeezing. The Europeans, I think, inherently believe that it's okay. Europe will pay for it. We'll basically get the ECB to buy our bonds, and the Rassemblement National is pretty vague on how all this will be spent. But all three parties agree we will spend more money, which brings you to again this big question of whether Europe will agree come September or whether Europe will basically put a block to it. In the meantime, I think today, imagine yourself a French entrepreneur, and you wake up this morning to a party that's going to have some power, telling you that what you need going forward is much more taxation of profits and much stricter labor rules, even though you already have some of the strictest labor rules in the world. Now, if you're an entrepreneur, is this an environment where you're going to hire new people, where you're going to invest? Obviously not. I think the next 6 months is going to see an absolute collapse in investment in France as we figure out, A, what the relationship with the EU is, and what the new labor laws are, and what the new taxes are going to be.
Why is it then that the markets are not being spooked?
I'm going to say words you're supposed to never say, but I think the markets are getting it wrong on this one. Now, I know we're supposed to have a holy respect for markets and their foresight, etc., but I do think the markets are calling it wrong on this one. I think the markets are breathing a sigh of relief because for a month, the FT, the economists, etc., were telling us that the Rassemblement National was coming and that it was going to be a disaster. And so today they're breathing a sigh of relief. But as you project yourself over the coming months, it's all bad news. It really is all bad news. You've got a crisis coming between France and Europe in September. And I think by the end of this year, you'll have terrible growth numbers. And so, I think this is a bearish development. It's bad news for the euro. It's bad news for the French bond market.
And there's this other question. It's not simply how much money to spend and how much to tax. It's also who to spend it on. Because, of course, this is the big elephant in the room in French politics, which is the question of immigration. Le Pen has been proven to be very popular in her idea of national preference. How do you think that's going to play out, that conversation? Because it feels like a bit of a tinderbox in France, to say the very least, and one that isn't just going to simmer down now because of these results.
France is basically organized along three main zones. You have an urban centers, mostly in Paris, of people who work in government, who work in finance, who work in media, who do fine and do well. Then you have, let's call them the Zone A people. Then you have the Zone B people, who are mostly immigrants working for the Zone A people. It's the nannies, the Uber drivers, the delivery workers, etc. And then you have the Zone C people who live out in the countryside and whose social services keep getting cut. The Zone A people are your Macron voters, and that's very clear on the map. When you look at the map, basically in urban centers, Macron did very well, and elsewhere he did terribly.
So like metropolitan technocrat types. This is...
Exactly. And your Zone B people, your immigrants, voted for the Front Populaire, and they voted en masse for the Front Populaire because they want more and more social services to be brought to them. And the Zone C people voted for the Rassemblement National because they are the ones who've seen their services get cut. They have fewer local hospitals. They have fewer schools. It's so clear when you look at the map of where people voted.
How much is Macron going to suffer from that going forward? Because he's been accused many times of being a kind of Eurocentric technocrat. Is that only going to get worse for him in the coming months? Or is that actually something that he can use to his advantage, that he can say, look, I am the dam that stops the great waterfall of populism flowing over France?
That will be the arguments he makes towards Europe. And it'll be interesting to see whether Europe buys this argument or not. The real fight he's going to have isn't going to be with French voters. It's going to be with the Eurocrats, who ultimately have all the power. We all get very excited about the elections, but let's not kid ourselves. Who calls the shots? The French will propose a budget, but whether that budget is approved, that decision is not taken in Paris. That decision is now taken in Brussels. Now, to your point, I think what we've had, it's not just this election. This election is just a continuation of what we've seen over the past 30 years. Is an election of Zone A voters with Zone B voters, where the call Zone A voters is they tell Zone B, look, we'll keep giving you social services if you keep backing us up. And Zone C voters are left by the wayside. The big risk is that one day, of course, you get a union of Zone B and Zone D workers. If that ever comes to pass, then all dams will break.
That's the many against the few moment where there is some sort of horseshoe that allows for left and right to unite against the bureaucrat.
Exactly.
The situation in Israel has changed dramatically since the last time the French had an election. There is now a different relationship to ideas of anti-Semitism and whether or not Muslims are at home in France. And it feels like that has really been growing at pace over the last 9 months. Of course, Mélenchon has come out and said that they must recognize the state of Palestine. We don't know how much of his voter bloc came from Muslim French people, as well as kind of left-wing young people. But there is this question that you have to ask. How much has Israel played into this story?
I think it's played. And look, France is the third highest Jewish population in the world after the US and Israel. I think this is a terrible result for the Jewish community. Last night's vote is a terrible result for the Jewish community. You've had the great rabbi of Paris come out and said, look, if you're French today and Jewish, you should think of moving to Israel. Yeah, I'm Roman Catholic myself, but if I was Jewish, and I hate to say this with every bone in my body, but if I was Jewish in France today, I don't know if I'd be very comfortable staying in France. And the fact that I hate the fact that I'm saying this, trust me.
How does it fit into an ascendant populism around Europe? We've seen it in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Italy. How does the French story fit into that?
Here, I think that the example of Denmark is fascinating, right? Denmark had a huge swing to the right-wing vote, and the center-right and center-left party basically said, okay, we heard you. You don't like this much immigration. You want more controlled immigration, and we're going to move in that direction. We're going to move to control immigration. And they did. And with that, the vote to the far right basically melted away. I think the big challenge in France, in Germany, frankly, you've had the same thing in Britain, now with the rise of reform, is big parts of the population are saying, look, we're not comfortable with this much immigration because our social services are falling apart, because schools are falling apart, hospitals, etc. And then most politicians turn around and tell people you're a racist bigot for saying this and for thinking this. And so inherently people say, well, if you're going to call me a racist bigot, I might as well vote like one. And this has been the biggest problem in France for the past 20 years is you've basically had somewhat uncontrolled immigration. You've definitely had failing public services. People see those two things happening at the same time. Of course, they're going to link them. And as they link them, they ask for politicians to do something about it. And all they get on the back end is insults.
Though in this country, I would say that we are an example of how the blob, the centre, can actually just take on a couple of the talking points of the more populist parties and quickly absorb almost all of their support.
I think the UK is going down the French route, where you're now having the split in the right between your Tory party and your Reform party, hereby leaving a boulevard for the left to be elected, which is exactly what we've had in France for the past 30 years. We've had a split in the right, a demonization of part of the right. So you have this in the UK, you say, oh, Reform, those guys could never join the government. Oh, Reform, those guys are a bunch of tin hat wearing kooks. Let's not even talk to them. Let's not give them time in the media. Let's call them names. This is exactly how we treated the Rassemblement National and how we've done so again. In the end, what it leaves you is a boulevard for the left to be elected in, for them to win way more votes than they otherwise would. This is exactly what we saw in the UK, and this is exactly what we saw in France. Again, the Front Populaire is the big winner last night. They won, 24% of the vote, when the Rassemblement National won 37% of the vote. And they end up with more members of parliament. I think what the question, if I was British, I would be asking myself is, oh my God, are we basically inheriting the French disease here, where the right gets split and then the left just owns everything, the cultural institutions, the newspapers, the educational system, you name it. They own that, not for the next electoral cycle, they own it for the next 2 generations. And as they do, it dramatically transforms your country.
Where are they getting it wrong that they're unable to unite this kind of right side of French politics?
For 30 years, the French right was massively divided. It's increasingly less divided because the traditional center-right of Les Républicains, what would be your Tory party, has basically spent the past 30 years slipping into irrelevance by refusing to tackle the issues that actually mattered to a growing part of the population. As immigration got bigger and bigger, as public services started to fail more and more, the French right wing kept saying, well, if you highlight these problems, you're a racist bigot, to the point where more and more people say, you know what, I don't want to listen to you anymore. So I think the big lesson of yesterday's election in France is actually, in France, we're slowly healing. And that, yes, the right wing lost this election, but the right wing is now starting to look more united than it did in the past. In Britain, you're 30 years behind in the process. You're 30 years behind us in this process. For the next 10, 15 years, you're going to have reform on the one hand, you're going to have the Tory party, you're going to have the Tory party called reform racist bigots, and they're both going to stay out of power as a result.
I mean, also in this country, I don't think we have a particularly meaningful left movement. I think that is very different to the Front Populaire. We do not have a particularly strong or philosophical left in this country anymore. It's been entirely eaten by the kind of centrist blob. So we've also got that problem. We actually have it on both sides. It's just that perhaps we're focusing more on the right here. Le Pen then, in 27, she is going to make another run. So how are her chances? Do you think she is better off now for this result and not having, Bardella put in a position where he might show his weakness over the coming years? Or is she in a worse position given the result from yesterday?
I actually think she's in a better position. Again, what the real looming crisis in France is September, when we have to present a budget to the EU, and there is no way the Rassemblement National could have presented a budget to the EU that would have been accepted. So they would have had a crisis. They would have been in government for 6 weeks over the course of a summer, not had a chance to do anything, and they would have had a crisis right up front, which would have, completely decredibilized them vis-a-vis the public opinion.
So Rassemblement National might actually be saved by this terrible result for them, or at least perceived to be a terrible result.
Let's be honest here. It's not that terrible result. They've added another 54 MPs. They've managed to completely unify the right, more or less. The Républicains have shown themselves to be broadly irrelevant. And now Macron has to deal with the consequences of his 10 years, because he was president 7 years and finance minister for 3, of government spending that went from 52% of GDP to 58.5% of GDP. He's the one who has to present now what he's done to the European Union. And here, to answer your question, what happens in 3 years is, if Macron in September gets told by the European Union, this doesn't go, you're breaking too many rules, you have to embrace austerity, then in 3 years' time, the Rassemblement National will be elected with a lot of votes, partly because over the next 3 years, you'll have demonstrations on the street as social spending gets cut. It's going to be an absolute bloodbath. So that's option one. Option two, the European Union rolls over. The European Union says, you know what, fine, spend what you want, and everybody else will follow that path. Spain, Italy, why wouldn't you? If the European Union rolls over for France, they have to roll over for everyone. In which case, the euro goes down, the European bond markets go down, and in that environment, you most likely end up with higher inflation that is seldom a very popular outcome with voters. But having said that, then if you don't have a crisis, if the European Union manages to avoid the crisis over the next 3 months, then, you could, maybe the centrists get reelected again next time around.
But it sounds like almost all roads lead to a second resurgence of Rassemblement National in your mapping out of this. Yes. Talk to me about Trump and Biden, because of course that's the other major factor that we're looking forward to in the coming months, is we will either have a Democrat or Republican president sitting in office in America. How will that change the likely outcomes of these variables?
I think what's fascinating, if you look at electoral politics today, everywhere across the Western world, the general narrative is throw the bums out. You just saw it in the UK. To some extent, you just saw this in France. I mean, Macron's party lost 100 seats. It is a bit of a debacle for them. Even if they manage to cling on to power, you're seeing this in Canada. Trudeau's lost a by-election that he should have never lost. So everywhere across the Western world, this throw the bums out, really except the United States, where it's like, oh, let's keep running the same two guys who are in their 80s. At this stage, I can't imagine we end up with a Trump versus Biden. The Democrats are going to have to run somebody else. He's too affected. He's too old. He's going to lose too many states for the Democrats. And if they run Biden, they realize they're going to lose everywhere down tickets. So they have to put somebody else. But the fact that they put somebody else this late in the game will really, I think, disgust a lot of American people. So I think we have to assume that Trump wins. Now, concretely, what does that mean? That probably means more foreign bashing. Trump will try to talk down the U.S. dollar. He already is trying to talk down the U.S. dollar. He'll talk down the U.S. dollar. He'll force Europe. He'll force Japan. He'll force China to revalue. It might make for tense Europe-U.S. relationships at a time when, frankly, Europe will be feeling fairly uneven to begin with. So, yeah, none of this is super bullish Europe.
What about the kind of Malonification then of the populist movements? Because, of course, will inevitably happen to the left parties, the Mélenchonites, and then eventually perhaps to the Le Pens and the Bardelians. Once they get into any sort of position of power, it often happens that somebody who's been raised up on a populist platform finds that when they get into grinding the gears of government, it's not quite as easy as it seemed when you were just writing florid manifestos. How do you think this left aspect of the government will fare with joining with Macron and trying to make policy? And then looking forward, if Le Pen and Rassemblement National did do well in the upcoming elections, would they struggle as well? Is there the risk of what's happened to Giorgia Meloni, where you basically become neutered almost instantly upon entering government?
The left is going to fare very badly in the French government. Again, you've got this huge European presentation of the budget, which is a big hurdle for them to clear. And at the same time, if you come in saying we're going to raise minimum wage, we're going to cut the retirement age, we're going to increase government spending, we're going to increase taxes, entrepreneurs are going to sit back and not do any investment. They're not going to do any hiring. So the growth numbers in France are going to be tanking over the next 6 months. So I think it's going to be a pretty brutal wake-up call for the far left. Let's not kid ourselves. What happened last night was a vote. It was the win of Paris over the provinces. Again, which is, you could say, an almost constant of French history. It's Paris versus the countryside.
Though it was a constant that we thought was going to be thwarted last week when we saw that map, which was incredibly stark. And you and I could have been sat here a week ago talking about how this was going to happen, because it was this kind of sea of Rassemblement National with this tiny little pocket of Paris in the middle, and it looked like what was going to happen was that great sea was going to overwhelm the little pond of power in the middle, but it hasn't.
A house divided upon itself doesn't stand, right? This is hardly a stable situation. Is another yellow jacket movement possible? Let me put it to you this way. If Europe imposes austerity on France, with the left wing, the Zone B people that have been promised a lot, if they get nothing because Europe imposes a lot of austerity, I would say a new yellow jacket isn't possible. It's probable, which is why last night's result, I think the market is getting it wrong. This is a result that promotes instability. Maybe not this morning, maybe not over the course of the summer. So the Olympics will go off fine now, which, is good news. But come the fall, September, October, things can get messy very, very quickly.
Prime Minister Gabriel Attal has handed in his resignation. Macron is trying to make him stay, at least for the intervening period, so that he can oversee this changeover in government. But he seemed deeply distressed with the result. He said, tonight a new era begins for France. What do you think the new era is?
Well, the new era is going to try to be, I think Macron today will feel like he has a popular legitimacy to ask for more spending, which he's done the whole time, by the way. Again, he came in, it was 52%, government spending was 52%. He came in promising reform. He came in promising a lot of crawling back of the government, which was why he managed to capture a lot of the right-wing votes and the center-left votes. It was why he captured all the retiree votes and all the people who, talk like me and dress like me. Everybody voted for Macron because we thought, okay, here's a guy who gets it. He's a competent technocrat. And he actually delivered the opposite. Government spending grew. Number of people in employment in the French government grew. And now today, he's going to turn to the European Union and say, I have a legitimacy to do even more of that. This is what the ballot box wants. So you basically, you guys have to give it to me. Personally, I don't think the European Union goes for it. Like I said, we're heading into a crisis for September, October. the European Union won't stand for it, and Macron will be found to be the legendary naked emperor.
Louis-Vincent Gave, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to Louis-Vincent Gave for coming on there and sharing his economic analysis and social analysis of the French situation. The markets are wrong, he says. You heard it here first. Come September, Macron is headed for a fright, and maybe further down the line, we will see a resurgence in Le Pen's Rassemblement National. We await to see if that prediction comes true, but we're interested always to hear what you think down in the comments. Thanks for watching. This was UnHerd.